Welcome to part 2 of the gravitas of thinking. We ended part 1 on the note that Newton, even though he already speaks and formulates his physical theory and formulas around the notions of relative motion and relative space, he still at least implicitly drew on the assumption that there is something, that there exists something like an absolute space, and that there is the real possibility of something like an absolute motion. So a motion that that happens or that takes place not only relative to all kinds of other motions, so a manifold of motions that happen simultaneously, that takes place at the same time at once, but that there's a specific kind of motion that is in that sense unconditioned by other motions, that we do not depict in relation to or relative to other motions, but that we can depict, or that we can discern against or in contrast to or in relation to an absolute space. So an absolute background against which this motion takes place, and that would be not a relative motion but an absolute motion. And how does Newton come up with this assumption? It is a conclusion that Newton draws, or that he thinks is necessary while he was kind of witnessing or observing the so-called bucket experiment. So what is the bucket experiment? So in the bucket experiment, you have a laboratory and you have a bucket that is filled with water and that is fixed with a thread on the ceiling, and then the bucket is brought into motion, is spinning. So there is a certain kind of momentum of this bucket, and at first only the bucket is rotating, and at some point then after some time also the water in the bucket is rotating, and then again after some more time, right, not the bucket is rotating anymore, so the bucket is standing still, is not moving, again, at least for the observers in the laboratory, but the water in the bucket is moving. And Newton says, okay, so how is this possible? And this is the point where he invokes the notion or the explanation, and he thinks this is necessary to explain this kind of phenomena and this observation, that the movement of the water at the end of the experiment is an absolute motion, a motion that is happening because the water is moving against or in relation to the absolute background, which is an absolute space, or which is the absolute space. So the water is not moving against or relative to some other kind of movement or rotation, but rather it is moving in relation to this kind of background that the absolute space provides. And he makes this assumption that something like an absolute space does exist, and he gives the possibility, or he grants the possibility of an absolute space and the possibility of an absolute motion in his theory. And it is first then with Ernst Mach that it is raised doubt that there's really the necessity to invoke the notions of an absolute space in order to come up with an explanation for the movement of the water at the end of the bucket experiment. so what is the argument that Mach is providing? Well, the absolute space that Newton is invoking and that he is drawing on to explain the bucket experiment in the full scope of the observation is not observable, right? We cannot observe this absolute space, and even more, it is that we cannot measure it. So Newton says, okay, we can, in a sense, we have an indication that there must be something like an absolute background, because, right, the water at the end of the experiment is moving while the bucket is not moving anymore. So there must be something against which the water is rotating or moving. But Mach says, okay, that doesn't need to be like an absolute background or an absolute space that kind of provides the counterweight or the other part of the relationship, but rather he says, right, it could be that the water is moving against all the masses, and the masses are rotating and moving of the galaxy. So not only is the movement right for the observers in the laboratory, the everything else besides the water, at least in the observation, is not moving, is not rotating. But if we zoom a little bit out, right, the Earth is spinning. The Earth is spinning, and the whole galaxy is moving. So, and Mach says, right, there is a relativity to this motion that we can invoke to come up with an explanation of the water moving or rotating in the bucket experiment. And he says, right, we should be careful with giving in to the assumption of an absolute space, because we cannot observe it and we cannot measure it. And that is speaking against, or is going against, his notion of a sound natural scientific approach, an empirical scientific approach. Right, that with additional assumptions that we perhaps doesn't need, or that we do not need, and that we have to keep track on, and that we have to give arguments for, which will become difficult if we want to go with an empiricist and positivist approach, and we cannot measure and observe it. This is something like a thing of the mind. It's a assumption that that we come up with because it kind of fits and kind of closes the problem of explanation. Mach is arguing that there is motion of the water, so that the water is in motion. The water is rotating, no doubt, right? The water is rotating, but it's rotating against all the galaxies that are in relation to the laboratory and to the bucket and the water. And so the bucket and the water in it. So he says there's no absolute background. So there's no container that is inhabited by all these galaxies. And here it's interesting that the word in German, the word for space is Raum, and it comes from the old High German word Rum, which is R-U-M. And first of all, it meant something like that which is not filled, or that which is not stuffed, so which grants the possibility to be fulfilled, or which allows for stuff to be placed. So there's no container that is inhabited, Mach says, but rather it's that everything that is of matter, is of relevance for this experiment, stands in relation to the laboratory And so all the mass in the universe is interrelated, and hence the spinning of the water is not absolute motion, but rather it's relative motion, relative against all the other masses that form a kind of web of interrelations. And Albert Einstein was really appealed by that approach of Ernst Mach. So Ernst Mach was a scientist and a philosopher. And Einstein was driving the idea forward that we should do away with notions and concepts which content or claim we cannot observe and we cannot measure. So this was really a driver for his investigation, for Einstein's investigation. So he kind of furthered and continued the project of Ernst Mach to a certain degree. And he also called that at some point the Mach's principle, or Mach's principle. So he called to this principle, or he invokes this principle, so as a guiding trajectory at a certain point in his career. He wanted to fully buy into that principle. Respectively, he claimed to really have been following that principle in his work. And he develops relativity theory and binds together space and time, right? And so while doing that and geometrizing the kind of the problem of gravitation, he claims to have followed Mach in his approach. So, and Einstein is not just doing this notionally, but he's doing that with the help of mathematics and Minkowski, so a mathematician, and he also draws on the work of other mathematicians. And then in the end, he eliminates, so Einstein even eliminates in his theory or in his formulation the hyphen in between space and time, and just called it space-time continuum. Now what happens is that the questions come up, okay, so space-time is banded by masses, but doesn't we need somehow a kind of backdrop again? So that would be the stance or the fallback to a Newtonian notion of absolute space. So every backdrop that you imagine to be there for all the relative motions or the relative spatial constellations. Doesn't we need something in which space-time is banded, or against which space-time is banded? So wouldn't we not just, again, need something alike to a container that is kind of securing, holding, or framing space-time, or giving a backdrop of some kind, a background to which then space-time is kind of the figuration, and then we can also imagine how it is a banded figure, right? A banded mathematical figuration. But Einstein sticks to his credo: no absolute background. We want to get rid of that. We don't want to fall back on Newton, because that means we would invoke or drew upon a metaphysics. So we would drew upon principles that are not observable, are not measurable, but that are invoked in terms of explaining the order of things, the realm of physics, or the world of the physical relationships, so that we end up with metaphysical principles, or a beyond of that space-time continuum, right? A vertical relationship where there is some kind of backdrop to the space-time continuum, which kind of encapsulate or gives a certain handle and hold to the space-time continuum, and grants a kind of security and a hold, a pause, a moment of enduring and not only continuity, but also some kind of eternal or ephemeral medium, which Maxwell also kind of invokes in terms of the ether. But with Einstein attempts to describe the space-time continuum in terms of field equation, he was also kind of drawn into the idea of giving account for the space-time continuum, physical mathematically, in terms of field equations and a field tensor that can be mathematically described and that gives rise in combination with or in relation with the field to space-time, so to the space-time continuum. So there is perhaps then not a not an absolute backdrop, because it's still kind of there's still a continuity, I think, with sticking to physical mathematical description or formalization and formulation. And so what happened is, again, the suspicion that the space-time continuum is, at least by tendency, in need of an absolute background conception. And this notion that there is something like a metaphysical relation, or that we have something like an absolute space that is filled with the ether, that is mediating what is going on in that space, that is an idea that especially natural science want to do away with. Why? Well, because the ether was proposed by Maxwell to explain or give an account for how light is traveling or is moving. That is, this is not happening in a nowhere, or that this cannot happen in nowhere, but that there must be a certain medium which is filling all of space, and this is said to be the ether, or it is proposed to be the ether, as a homogeneous and infinite, enduring medium against or despite of time, which then mediates the movement of light. But this was especially something that could not be proven and that could not be measured. But told differently, it was shown by Einstein while applying geometry on that problem, and showing arguably that this hypothesis and assumption of the ether was not tenable, and that we could have a far more suitable and arguable solution that is not dependent on this kind of ethermal medium. And there's not so much different between the ether and absolute space, so the notion of an absolute background medium, in quotation, not in quotation, but in parentheses. So something that is spinning its thread through the working of time, and which makes possible the hanging together or the being together somewhere, and sheds a background in a certain, in that sense, a ground to the physical event or events. This is where we are heading. Now, Husserl, Edmund Husserl, a philosopher of the 20th century, asked himself, or he asked back, better to say, to the origin of geometry, or the roots of geometry, so where geometry came from, and what were the conditions that established and made possible that geometry could enter history, was capable of entering history. So, and we can remember, or we invoke that Einstein was drawing heavily and applying heavily geometry on the kind of problems and question he was faced with in regard of the Newtonian notion of motion and space, and also the kind of explanation that Maxwell was giving for the movement of light. And now the problem that Husserl is facing as a mathematician and as a scientist, someone who's engaged in science and drives this project forward, is that Husserl says it's by no means possible anymore to track all these proofs that we have in mathematics and in geometry, a lot of them which are not even given to you in any illustrative demonstration, so in anything that is, some that can be pictured easily. of what they are proving, but rather these proofs are working on a high abstraction level. In that sense, so they are peeled off the concrete illustrative content, or the content that is possible to be represented easily. And even on the minimum of intuiting, line and point. So line and point are really the minimum forms of what we can intuit, right? If we draw something, and if we kind of try to picture certain geometric problems, right? The Euclidean forms, line and point, are the most easiest or the most simplest, are the minimum information, or the minimum figurations that we can draw on. So, and they peel even that off, and what you're left with are formulas and equations. And so it's not possible for anyone, even the best researchers, to go through all the proofs and evoke again the meaningful content and the illustrative demonstration of all these proofs. And science is in a way a continual process, which is recursive and which is doing a lot of iterations. So especially in mathematics, you work with axioms. So if there are certain axioms and they cannot be shown to be flawed, but rather proved to be right in terms of the mathematical systems and consistent in themselves and in terms of what is happening in mathematics, mathematics will keep track of these assumptions and of these axioms, but they will basically apply them when they are not shown to be flawed or shown to be inconsistent. And there's always the possibility to ask back to them and question them. But at some point, right, you want to do math and you need to go with the axioms if they show them to be, like, helpful and applicable. And this is the field of tension that Husserl is kind of observing, that he's making out. Even further, because in mathematics is especially precarious, the situation, because there's so much going on the abstract level, so totally peeled off from any intuitive content or any illustrative demonstration. Rather, you have to, or you do, rely on these proofs that are on a really abstract level. But he sees also the same problem in other scientific fields. So for example, in physics, where the notion of space and time are kind of bracketed or displaced by something called space-time, without a hyphen, which is said to be a continuum and said to be able to bend or being banded by masses. So you have something like time dilation and length contraction in terms of relativity theory. So it's not possible. I mean, this is also what Niels Bohr says and what Einstein stresses. It's really hard, if not even impossible to a certain degree, to really picture that with the kind of intuitions that we have at hand, or with the reservoir of intuitive presentable content. And this, Husserl says, this is a problem, because now we have the live world people are invested in every daily, or on a daily basis. So they live their life and they have everyday problems. And on the other side, we have this project called science that is driven by so many people over so many decades. And Husserl says, okay, so there's a certain scissor, not only between theory and praxis, but also between everyday life, which would be more the practical part, and theoretical life, so the scientific endeavor. Nevertheless, these spheres are not totally distant spheres or absolute divergent, right? We're making use of navigation systems, for example. Navigation systems work because we set them up in a way that they are working correctly. And this is just because we have the equations from Einstein's relativity theory. The main point Husserl is making, or the main thing Husserl is concerned with, is the impossibility to really re-invoke and experience by oneself all these meaningful contents that are important and that are addressed in these scientific proofs. So at a certain point, where there was an insight, something that was intuited, and that the person who was conducting the proof had seen, or that he witnessed, that he experienced, that he was on the right track, that this is working out, and that this is kind of consistent and can be applied, is helpful. So this by yourself, seeing and proving, following the proofs to their evidence. I see it. Sense is attuning, appearing to me in respect of this proof. So this is something that is lacking, or that we cannot close this kind of the concatenation of all these evidence of proofs, or this experiential content of evidence that can be or should be invoked, should be possible to invoke in terms of these proofs, because there's so many, and a lot of them are, super abstract. He's then trying to investigate this relation, our relation to sense, in theoria and empiria and praxis. And what he's developing is what he then calls phenomenology. And the idea is, on a bottom line, that in all of these scientific projects and endeavors, we are dependent on our experience. So even when you're doing a mathematical proof, and this is highly abstract, or this can be highly abstract, and you're using formulas, you're doing that while you're experiencing written down formulas and been situating in a certain kind of room, or a laboratory, or a faculty, and you're looking if that is working out in terms of the inner logic and consistency of the mathematical axiomatic system. Nevertheless, you are doing that while you're experiencing what is going on. So, and mathematics, and this is kind of something to be remarked, is working with ideal objects, right? The Euclidean forms, you don't find them somewhere in nature, somewhere out there in the world, but rather they are invoked on the paper, first of all, and in the space of intuition. But also when you're doing observations in terms of chemistry, biology, or physics, right, you're dependent on your experience, even if that experience is mediated by some kind of apparatus or some instrument. And this is one clue that he says, okay, so all these sciences are dependent on experience, so let's study our experience to provide a fundament to science and to kind of secure and give us guidance that we are still in tune with the sphere of sense and the sphere of evidence. Now, if we want to do it in a way that is capable of bringing us somewhere and further our understanding, we are not in a situation Husserl says to be neglective of the history of philosophy, or this kind of the position Husserl takes. And so as a mathematician, he looks in the history of philosophy, and he's then a trained philosopher at a point. And what he finds is, or who he finds is somebody like Aristotle, who had developed formal logic. And so there's a nexus to mathematics. And Aristotle is really keen to the development in mathematics at his time, and in the study of formal rules of thinking. So thinking a certain state of affair or a certain affair through in terms of certain necessary and categorical rules, and to be consistent in that, and to be sound, and to kind of be true to your groundwork, which are then the formal rules or the formal logic, and of handling ideal objects. And then again, he's also invested in physics, Aristotle, and he's doing metaphysics, or which is then later called metaphysics, ta meta ta physica, so the books after the physics, where it looks for first principles that are the origin or that invoke the origin or the point of departure for giving an account of the physical world. And he finds in the language of his words, of his time, words like forma and hyle. So the former we get our notion form from, and the latter is somewhat akin to matter, even though this word doesn't exist at Aristotle's time. But hyle is deriving rather etymologically, or can be traced back to wood, or means wood in ancient Greek. So we have the form, and Plato speaks about the idea or the eidos, so the outer appearance of something. And we have the stuff. It is made out of something, right? Everything is made out of something, it seems. How something comes to us in terms of a perceptual encounter with a thing or with the world in general. And Aristotle says this is always happening, or we can always look right to that in terms of experience, and in all our sensual perception we have these traits that are in a way situation invariant, namely that everything has a form to it, that we can describe it in terms or in regard of that form, of that figuration, and that we can compare these forms, and that they remain over time or shift over time, and that everything is made out of something, it seems, or it has some constitutive stuff that it is made out of, some textile or fabric that is constituted of or from and thwarted into a form. That stuff is or must be informed so that it appears then as the thing that we perceive, this individual thing that holds a place. And so Aristotle comes to the conclusion at a certain point that forma, is, when we think about it, really what gives actuality to things, because stuff, is everywhere. But what makes certain things specific and outstanding and give them certain traits and kind of relieve them from their background is their form. So this is what stands out, the form. And this is where the real deal lies, so to say, for Aristotle. This is the trait that really is a bit more profound and should be a bit more emphasized, one could say. And after spending some time on Aristotle, Husserl then goes on to Kant. And he looks what Kant is doing. And Kant is doing something like measuring and stepping out our capacity for cognition and our faculty of knowing and knowledge, or our capacity for knowing and knowledge. So what we are able to cognize and what we are really able to know, or what we are able to know at all. Because what Kant argues is that we have perception, and we can do in science and science. So we can do, or we can make use of significant figures, which are signs, and we can do science with them. So we can conceive and apprehend certain things, and we can take them in our sight and grasp and study them as scientific objects. For example, as empirical objects, objects that can be observed and measured in terms of natural science. But it would be naive to think that these objects, which we study in terms of science and which we study with formulas, for example, so with science, are coming to us untouched by any means of us cognizing them. So Kant says, okay, we ourselves, we have certain capacities and incapacities, limits to our cognition too. And in that sense, also in our attempt and striving and following the trait of wanting to know, there are certain capacities we have that we can draw on, that are affording us our cognition, and certain limits we have. But first of all, we have to discern what are the affordances and restriction of our apparatus of cognition. We have to critique these capacities and these faculties, and we have to measure them out so that we can then put them into the equation of cognition, of generating insight and knowledge. So we have to measure them out, and we have to step them out to then be able to say, okay, this is the lens we are looking through and that we are cognizing through, or in terms of which we are cognizing, so that then we have a first of all the means to relativize the object that we are studying in terms of science, which are then objects which appear to us, which appear through our sense and sense apparatus, but not only the sensibility, but also the understanding. So sensibility and understanding are the two stems of cognition in Kant, and they are working together. They are inseparable, but they also do not fall into one place, but there's a difference. And in this specific manner, we can shed light on our capacities and incapacities, perhaps. And we can discern the limits for cognition. And first of all, we then are perhaps able to put them into the equation and are then hopefully not anymore as naive in thinking that we're just roaming around and in roaming around, we are thinking of ourselves like cameras which photograph a one-to-one reality that is out there exactly the way it is presented to our minds in our experience, or the way it gets presented in terms of our of the phenomenal appearing of things. And this is what Husserl sees with Kant, that Kant directs and bends the light of reason on the presupposition of thinking themselves, and is measuring out our apparatus of cognition and our capabilities in that sense of knowing. So he's really analyzing, discerning and dissecting the subject of knowledge, which entered the stage with René Descartes, who is distinguishing famously between the res cogitans and the res extensa, the thinking thing or thinking substance, and the res cogitans and the res extensa, all the extended things, the extended substance. So he makes the observation that, or comes to the conclusion that all things out there in the world that we can observe and that we can interact with are extended. But the trait that we follow or we engage in while we do engage in thinking, what we call thinking, it seems it's not so much extended. So there must be a differentiations on these grounds, Descartes concluded. So he comes up with the notion of res extensa, or the extended things, and the notion of res cogitans, which he derives at, or he can ground then as a kind of destinate and isolate by having radical doubt against all and everything, like all that is part of the outside world, but also mathematical axioms, also ideal objects. So there could be an evil genius that modified, manipulated, and set the stage so that we think, okay, we have, and we do study ideal objects and we study eternal truths, and have these mathematical axioms that are solid proved. But really, this is all this could be all staged. This could be all just an illusion, and we are subjects to manipulation. But what he finds is, or what he concludes then, where he comes out, is that still we're engaging in this radical doubt. The trait he can be certain about is that it is still who he's deceived, and it is still who he's doubting. So the thinker in this sense, or the thinking in the sense of a performative engagement in thinking itself, in this activity, this is really important for Descartes, because this is kind of the backbone of the ground of subjectivity and of everything, because it's not the subject, because it's not a subject in terms, or in respect of an embodied person that he's speaking about in that sense. At least he's not speaking about a body anymore. So the body is for Descartes pretty much a machine and working in mechanical ways. But it is really the engagement in thinking itself which leads also performatively to doubting. So the subject is rather a kind of a minimum point that is performatively invoked, or that gets performatively invoked. Kant speaks of a punctus imaginarius, so it's a like the point where the central perspective is drawn from, or is projected from. It cannot be seen by itself, but it's rather something that we come up with while engaging in thinking and engaging in this method of radical doubt. So it's a point from which the world is rendered, and rendered intelligible, is grounded from, so is opened up. And it's a world of representation, because everything is represented from this point, this sensus, or this punctus imaginarius. So it's a subject. So the notion of subject that we're speaking of here is totally stripped off. It's nothing like an embodied person anymore, but it's and so it's also not subjective in that sense that it belongs only to every person, but rather it's something trans-individual or trans-subjective, it seems. And it's all temporalized, it's all performative. So to secure this ground, it's not enough to sentence this one time, or to capture this one time the sentence ego cogito certum est, ego cogito certum existo certum est. So the famous sentence of Descartes. But you have to repeatedly engage in thinking every time you have radical doubt. You have to, every time you feel lost and you feel that the ground underneath your feet is slipping away, you have to engage in thinking, and then to derive at the ego cogito ego existo certum est. And then you have a point again where you can redirect, and you have a trajectory again, a guiding a guiding orientation line, and you can orient yourself because you have ground under your feet again, to a certain degree, a minimum. So it's a minimum of ground to go into the future, which is then this abyss of nudity and of open horizon, which integrates all kinds of contingencies, because you always have to ground again and again and again the point from where you are arguing and from where you are speaking. So you have to ground again and again the point from where you are arguing and from where you are speaking, namely the point of the subject of knowledge, of the subject of representation. This is what Husserl finds with René Descartes in a nutshell. And then he comes to Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And there comes a certain problem with Hegel, because what Hegel concludes, again in a nutshell, is that, well, he says, well, gentlemen, so these have all been gentlemen, hopefully, and to a certain degree this already changes, that there is a balance between the genders that are engaging in philosophy. But, well, Hegel must say, well, gentlemen, you did all great works in a way, because science is, of course, always invested or engaged in and investigating into what stays invariant, situation invariant. So invariant from situation to situation. And despite all the change, what remains. So science is having this map approach, you could say, in the sense that you learn how to read a map and how to read different maps and how to look at certain situations and map them. And what you find is that in terms of this situation, you have a flux, you have changing. These situations are changing from one to another. They're changing, but you look for something that remains invariant, that remains the same in all that is changing. And Hegel calls this das Wesen, that which is abiding, that which is invariant throughout the going on of time and the shifting and changing flux of the world. And now Hegel says, okay, you all did that to a certain degree, like Aristotle, Descartes, Kant. But look, the one main question is this thing with Hyle, right? So it was Aristotle speaking about Hyle. We remember Hyle and Forma. And with Kant, we then have the two stems of our cognition, which is sensibility on the one side and the understanding. So the one provides the Empfindungen, the material of the sensual, and the other provides the notions or the concepts, the understanding. The one brings the notion, the other delivers the essential material, so to say. And there you have also this trait of materiality, the sensual materiality, or the sensual material, and so that which Kant calls Empfindungen, this minimal trait, where there's something going on that is not dependent on the understanding, or that doesn't come into existence by the mind, but that kind of gives the material that the understanding, the mind, then can work with. And so you have these traits of Hyle and materiality also of Hyle, materiality, and forma, so the notions also in Kant, or the schematas that are mediating or that are integrating. And then there are also like full-blown materialistic positions in philosophy to Hegel's time. And Hegel says, okay, so look, the real question, the real state of affair that we have to look into at this point, if we want to defend a materialistic position at all, and we want to say it's not everything dependent on the subject, so, and we want, first of all, to say that it's not that everything comes into existence by us thinking of it. Not everything is dependent on this I think of Descartes. Nevertheless, this I think is extremely important for Hegel. So philosophy is entering into truth again with the I think of Descartes. Hegel says so that all the world would be dependent on thought, on the form of thought, a form of ideality, on ideal objects, would be kind of a kind of position one could take, but for example, Berkeley, I think, takes this position in a way. But if we rather want to say that there is a real change, that there really is something that we can learn, or that we can have insights into, because it's not of our making, in a sense, it's not solely dependent on us, kind of evoking it or bringing it into existence while thinking of it. So if you want to defend or hold this position, Hegel says, seriously, now what all these thinkers have found, like Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant, is that it's naive to hold a position where you just defend matter and nothing else. So that matter is the only thing that is real, that we should be interested in at least, that is the only thing we should be interested in, at least when we want to do science proper. Why? So Hegel gives the argument that even the materialistic question, so the question of matter, and that everything is, in the end, everything that is kind of grounded and that is sound must come or must draw on a notion of matter and must be explained in terms of matter. Right, so even this materialistic question, and then the full-blown position, the radicalized position that all that is real is matter, is itself already invested into the thought or form, or the form of thought. It already is a question, right? And in this way brought into the form of thought. And matter is first of all a concept, a notion, a philosophical notion. Not from Aristotle, but Hyle is the notion from Aristotle, and but matter is then later brought up in terms of the history of philosophy. So it's not something, matter, it's not something that we can observe, but we came up with it as a notion or a concept, and we brought it into a form of thought. We did notional and experiential work, and we came up with this notion. But it's really already invested, or this position is already invested, this position of materialism is already invested in the ideal stakes of the game, so to say. So you cannot make science without also paying attention to the form of thought and the movement and activity of thinking. And you cannot hold the radical scientific materialistic position without also doing some form of metaphysics. So in order to come up with explanations. So a good way to exemplify this is Kant, who says, right, when we do science and also kind of speak about the metaphysical first. So when we do science, and Kant also speaks about the or has a book which is called The Metaphysical First Grounds or First Principles of Every Natural Science, that as a scientist we have these two possibilities. We can observe, and then we can just observe and note our measurements and describe the correlations of our variables in terms of mathematical formulation, and then we would need to leave the table and leave the room and drop our pen. But there's a certain tendency and yearning for us also to engage in explanation, that we explain what we just observe. And Kant calls this Actus der Urteilskraft, the act of judgmental force, or the act of judgment. A really good way to demonstrate that is within psychology. There's was a debate between Tolman and Skinner, and Tolman made experiment with rats, and he built and set up certain labyrinths and placed some food in there, and it was the food was always placed on the right side of the labyrinth, which had the form of a cross, and the rat was placed at one spot, and the food was always on the right side of the rat. And the rat couldn't smell the food, so it seems they were conditioned that the food is always on the right side, that they go to the middle of the cross and then they head right, to come to the food. Then again, at some point, Tolman switched the starting position of the rats to the mirrored side, but he did not switch also the food. So the food was now on the left side of the rat. Of the cross labyrinth, and rather than go to the right, the rats did not turn right repeatedly. So different rats did not turn right, but left. And Tolman found this to be strange because, according to Pavlov's experiment with the dog, right, in the conditioning experiment, we should assume and expect that the rat moves to the right. And every time to the right, because it's conditioned, it always gets a certain incentive when it moves right, namely the food. But it's not the case. So how do we explain that? And this is exactly what Kant means. That Tolman wants to explain his observation and his findings. So the radical position would be that of Skinner, and this is something Skinner was invested. Doing radical behaviorism, and Tolman is doing cognitive behaviorism. So later, these streams of experimental psychology were called, or these approaches to psychology were called like them. And Skinner is saying we shouldn't introduce explanative assumption like Tolman is doing. He introduced the notion of cognitive maps, or the model of cognitive maps, and speaks of cognitive processing or processes that are going on in the mouse, that the mouse is able to adapt and reorient. But Skinner rather says just all we can do is the observational work or the measurements. And then we have certain variables. So we have control variables, and we should control as much variables as possible. And then we change only one variable, like the food position, and we have to make sure that the rat is not smelling the food, and that the rat does not have anchor points outside of the labyrinth, and so on. And then we can have control variables, and we can look what the dependent variable is doing, how it turns out, and then we can describe that, the kind of results in terms of mathematical formalisms, so in terms of mathematics. But this is then all we can do. We can describe these correlations and these kind of relationships of the variable values, so to say. But we shouldn't come up with intervening variables like the assumption of the rats kind of developing cognitive maps where they can adapt and, to a certain degree, reinvent their map of the environment and kind of react to certain different circumstances by doing something that Tolman calls cognition. We, in a sense, as a scientist, as rigorous scientists, Tolman says, cannot just introduce a new proposition or something like cognitive maps or some interfering variables that we suppose to explain what we or that we suppose or that we suppose to explain what we just observed. But we really have to be strict in a sense and do a radical approach, which is just looking at the rat as a functional organism, as a input-output black box that is reacting to certain stimuli. But there's nothing like representation or cognition that we can suppose that is going on in the mouse brain, so to say. This is just something we project into the behavior of the mouse. And you can think that further and also conceive of the human being as an organism which is just reacting to stimuli and which just imagine or has the idea of itself that there's certain mental representation, certain mental activities and cognitive processes with certain representable contents going on that can be studied. But really what is going on would be that this would be one position, is just neural firings that respond to a certain stimuli. And so this is the problem already Kant was kind of carving out or was emphasizing with the notion of der Actus der Urteilskraft and stressing that natural science needs metaphysics, philosophy, at least if they want to explain and to engage in explanation in this act of judgment. And he says this is also something we cannot do away with. Right? We work with regulative ideas, we are engaged in reason, and we always head for explanation. We are always heading for explanation, it seems. But Skinner provides at least a different attempt, different proposal. Now, with Hegel, we have this whole aspect radicalized, that he says, right, even when you scientists speak about matter, or you materialists speak about matter as something is self-standing, something autark that kind of holds itself and repeats itself in time, or that repeats itself and generates something that we then call time, has a certain continuity to it and a certain activity to it, and that it's not dependent on thought. We are really so much invested as researchers, as persons, as human beings, as prospective thinkers, that we inscribe ourselves, or we necessarily inscribe ourselves always into what we study, allegedly objectively. So, and this is constitutively for Hegel. I think it's more complex than for Hegel, I think. To break it down. And he's making this explicit and brings us to certain radicalization that all human activities, everything we are engaging in, is for Hegel connected, or there is a nexus to all human activities, and he brings this under the notion, or he coins this with the notion of spirit that we also have in human sciences. In German we speak in terms of the human science or liberal art, as they are called in the English vernacular. We speak about, or we at one point spoke about Geisteswissenschaften. And he speaks of spirit. Hegel speaks of spirit, Geist. So these are all kinds of human activities that we can imagine. When we come up with a notion like matter now, and he really brings it to the absolute outset, and really bring this notion to the absolute outset of objectivity. So we develop and work out and correct ourselves to be as objectively as possible. So we really have worked out something there, namely a concept of objectivity. But the negative difference, which we are working against with our notion, this is something which cannot be brought into that can be eliminated, it seems. It's not yet part, so this negative difference against which we are working is not yet part of the notion, but it will at some point, because the notion in spirit is always related to this negative difference, which is the contingency of truth, one could say. And this is, I think, one way to explain it, because this notional work means a notion, or notional work, Hegel speaks about Begriffsarbeit, notional work, means that a notion is never finished. We are always working on our notions. We are always on the way. We are always looking. So spirit is always looking how these notions are related to each other, especially philosophical notions. They always shift, and they are shifting against each other. So language is in motion. And we are really in thinking owing to language and to this notion that we are doing notional work. And we are always already at the heart of matter, Hegel says, with these notions. But we have to refine them again and again. And we are working with these notions, or what is working between these notions, better to say it like this, what is kind of withdrawing in the difference between these notions is a negative difference that is driving our notional understanding forward. And this is what Hegel then will call absolute knowledge, that we have in a sense, or that we know that there's still something that is not yet fully inhabited by the notion, but the notion is already related to that. And by engaging in science, by doing notional work and doing scientific work, not just doing natural science, but by doing philosophy and natural science and human science, liberal arts, by doing all kinds and engaging in all kinds of human and cultural activities, we are driving this notional work, and we are engaging in the social world. We are conducting this notional and social kind of development, and we are working, or in a sense mining on the negative difference, that which is not yet brought into the notion and into our knowledge, or into our knowing, and which is this a trait of contingency of the truth, and bringing that into the knowledge is kind of the prospective direction in which we are heading. So this is how we can really do progress in philosophy, Hegel says, but also in thinking and in the scientific endeavor in general. And this is something mind-boggling, and it's hugely important, the work of Hegel, I mean. It's far more complex than I just sketched it out, but there is a certain problem going on, or a certain problem occurring, which we are confronted with. Namely, if even the notion we think is like the safeguard or the assurance of objectivity and of something that is not dependent on our form of thought, namely matter, or certain kind of materiality, if this is already invested, or so to say immanent to the form of thought and the activity of thinking, whatever that means concretely, I mean, it's really hard to depict what we exactly mean by thinking. Great thinkers, of course, often have thought about that. But first of all, we can, I think, conceive of thinking as conceptualizing in the sense of concipere, so bringing together, bringing under a notion different affairs, different phenomena, then to put them into a relation, associate them, or bring them into a into interdependence, or work out their interdependence. And we do that, or while doing that, we come to bigger and bigger contexts, and on which we are drawing, and we build bigger and bigger or greater and greater concepts, and then we end up with something like the notion of being or sense or matter or space-time. And so we find ourselves with a certain absolute background, maybe like absolute space or God, that we are relating ourselves to, or that we are perhaps, or that we perhaps don't want to evoke, but we invoke it implicitly. So this is often the case with kind of vertical relationships, where you have a physical world, and a meter, so to say, and a metaphysical concept or conceptualization or metaphysical underpinning, or at least a necessity to engage in metaphysics and philosophy to come up with principles and concepts that make sense of what we do then in terms of understanding the physical world. And you can, so one way was doing that with classical vertical relationships, where you had something like God, a signifier or a notion that holds everything in place, and that is kind of the safeguard to the discourse. And now in the after Nietzsche, probably we kind of, which is really difficult to do, we kind of try to do horizontal ontologies and horizontal philosophies. So right, we find ourselves not anymore, or we kind of find ourselves in the situation where we have perhaps this vertical tension, as Peter Sloterdijk calls it, but we try to not build like two-word models or dualism like Descartes did. We have the mind and the body. And the question then, of course, is right, how does the mind and the corporeal world come into a connection, or how are they interrelated? How can they speak with each other? And right, this is kind of the question you end up, or that Descartes ends up with. How do they communicate with each other? And so one way this can turn out is what we saw with Skinner, where you just have this kind of, or where you must conclude that the human being is cut from this position of spirit, or any designated position from which we think and speak and act, that kind of there is a distinction mark between the animal and the human, but rather it's all fully flat, it seems. Yeah, right, the same kind of stimuli reaction machine that is the rat, for example. And maybe we find a certain discomfort with this position, and then right, we have to do distinction, or we have to do differentiation between the notions, and we have to look and sort them out and set them apart and look into the concept and the assumption. What is the phenomena, what is the conceptual content that a notion is invested in, or that a notion speaks from, how does language speaks, and how or to what does it refer, and these words that we use. And this is a going on that we could call thinking, I guess. And thinking in that sense is then, as I said, it owes to language, right? It is deeply invested in language. I mean, it's a question if thinking can just happen through language. So if every way or path of thinking has traversed language, or if you can also think by means of art, for example. But usually we would associate thinking with language, first of all, and that we have forms of thought, deriving from this notion of forma, and right, that we come up with grammar and a certain syntax, the way we structure our language, and the way we make it into a meaningful, or we bring it into a meaningful discourse, or kind of the discourse makes itself meaningful. and renders itself intelligible. And then philosophy studies or investigates and kind of looks after the logos of this discourse. So what is the inner logic of this discourse in the broadest sense, profoundest sense possible. And so there's also this trait not only to draw together, to concipere, to grasp under notions, but to make distinctions and differentiations invested in language, and also invested in the structuring of language. And then again, it's that there are certain forms of thought that are kind of, or that can be derived at. So for example, for Kant, it's judgments. So Kant's form of thought is kind of the pinnacle is the notion of judgment. For Aristotle, in terms of formal logic, you have certain conclusion that you can derive and that you can logically deduce. So you have these, the pinnacle is kind of deduction and inferences that can be applied. And then with Hegel, you have, Hegel speaks of Gegensatz, which is something like the countersentence or the contradiction, the setting against each other, while being nevertheless related. So you have different forms of thought, and the role of philosophy, or the main strength of philosophy, is that you can put these forms of thought into relation to one another, and also the fundamental notions of disciplines. It can bring them into a relation, into a conversation. And as such, for example, there can be an interface, or can be interfaces between philosophy, politics, love, psychoanalysis, and aesthetics, to give some example that seems really important for philosophy nowadays. Why are these perhaps fields that are brought together, right? With politics, it's kind of the right, is, if we bring it on a simple term, politics is kind of invested in the question of the community and how we want to live communal as a group of people and as people in a whole. So there are general communal affairs that are discussed in politics. Then we have aesthetics, which kind of deals with the singular, philosophy, which deals, one could say, with the universal. And then we have this strange countersection with love and psychoanalysis that is kind of an irritation to this whole field. But this is a story for another time. So, right, in the first approximation, we can call thinking then this ability, or this thinking in philosophy, this possibility of kind of bringing into a conversation different forms of thought. But if the form of thought is something which you would call ideal, because yeah, it's a form of thought. Now, if this is something ideal, now if matter is necessarily and is a concept and is necessarily not only related, but is something or some notion that we can come up with by thinking, then the big question is if there is really still something that is limiting spirit, that is limiting the human activity and the scientific project, and also its thrust and its will, and right, that kind of provides or gives a counterweight to that kind of thrust. That is kind of the fulcrum, the point where you have an inscription into the system that is not itself part of the system. The system is related to it, but it gives as encounter the material for the understanding or for conceptualization. If you still have something like not a naive concept of matter, or if you still can have something like not a naive concept of matter, which would be like, you know, something that you cannot move through, that is interpenetrable, that has a certain consistency to it. That would be a naive notion of matter, right? Because you have something like liquids or gases, where this isn't the case anymore. Then you would have a notion of matter like being more a placeholder, a place occupier, better to say. Then you would end up with the question with absolute space, and you would say, okay, it's a space-time occupier rather than only a place occupier. And that would be a far better notion, perhaps. And then you would come into a bit of discussion, or you had to engage in discussions then with quantum physics, perhaps, but that would be a possibility. But the main thrust that we feel is if we can have at all a sophisticated notion of matter that is not reducible to a pure form of thought or to an idea, and that means that matter is to be then understood not only in terms of being an idea. This is also something that I think is going on in the chain between Maxwell and Einstein, that matter is to be said in a way autark, so it's not dependent on thinking or a form of thought. And maybe can also be an obstacle, or it can be even withdrawing from the forms of thought and from the grasp and sway of meaning. And that has a certain insistence, and that it has a certain insistence over time, that it insists and repeats itself, that it is active in some sense, so that it can, to a certain degree, be a trait of change in shifting circumstances. And the big question then with Hegel becomes if we can still have such a notion of materiality. And to bring that back, and then to come to an end, to bring that back to Husserl now, we saw that Husserl is speaking of the crisis of the sciences. And he's looking into philosophy and into these positions as a trained mathematician, but also as a trained philosopher. And he says, okay, we have to bracket this discussion and debate over the question if there's something like an outside material or physical world, if there's something like a material reality that is independent of the form of thought or thinking. But we rather have to look and to go with the trace of experience itself, which is a necessary condition for all kinds of everyday activities, but also of scientific endeavors or projects. And this is kind of the backdrop of everything that we engage in as humans. So all kinds of human activities are gathered or are necessarily only possible or have to go through experience, and we have to go through experience. So it's not only that the content or that some content has to go to experience, to go through experience to come to us, but we also have to live through that. And we have to study experiences in a really specific manner. Husserl will then introduce the notion of Erlebnisakt, so the lived through experience, the act of lived through experience, because he will study consciousness in a sense, but he will start to study consciousness with a really specific stance, which he takes from Brentano, which was another philosopher and his teacher, who spoke about the intentionality of consciousness, or who kind of concluded or comes to the conclusion that consciousness is always intentionally related, that it's always directed at something, so at an object. So it's always directed at something. So if we are conscious of something. So we are aware of something, and we are aware that we are aware of something. And this is then self-consciousness, the observation that we are aware of something. This would be self-consciousness. We're not only conscious, but we are conscious that we are conscious. That would be self-conscious, another description of self-consciousness. And Husserl is studying consciousness, but with this really specific lens coming from Brentano, and he's investigating how things and affairs are appearing to consciousness. And he's doing that with the notion of phenomenon, which comes from Greek. So Husserl is using Greek terms. So for example, for bracketing the discussion of the sheer pressing urgence of deciding if there is an outside world or an external material reality, or if we're just living in our minds or in a form of thought, in an illusional realm, and engage in thinking solely, exclusively. He said, okay, we bracket that, and he calls this, or takes up the notion of epoche from ancient Greek and from a certain philosophical tradition. But also phenomena, which is the appearing, so phenomena and phenomena is the appearance, but not the mere appearance, like for Kant, in contrast to the kind of real deal, the noumenon, which is not cognizable or is not addressable by our faculty of cognition. And the clue is that phenomenon is itself an ambivalent notion. So it has an inherent difference, because when something is appearing, it's always that there's something that is appearing. So we have a certain appearance, and we have the appearance, and we have that somewhat of a trait that is appearing in that appearance. And this is not Kant's notion of appearance, so not in contrast to the thing in itself, to the noumena. There's no noumena for phenomenology, but you have the appearance as the how of coming about or encountering, and you have that which expresses itself, or which kind of lingers and dwells and abides in that appearing. So you have the how of the appearance, so the modality and the way the experience is made up of or is constituted and shows itself, and you had something, but it's not really something. It's not a thing, it's not an entity that in a sense expresses itself in the appearance. So a good way to get your hand around this is to think of a disease. So you have symptoms, bodily symptoms that you can perceive and that are clearly a phenomenon that you can, or that a doctor can observe, and then he can come up with a certain etiology. So what is the reason, what is for the disease, what is the explanation that you are facing the disease, and then one can perhaps hopefully give you a treatment in the best case. But these are appearances and expressions of the disease, but what is itself coming to the fore but not showing itself is the trait that works itself through these appearances, and this is the disease itself. But the disease is then to be differentiated from the observable symptoms. And this is kind of the differentiation that Husserl also follows with the notion of phenomena. And he will then do that with two technical notions, or further that with two technical notions, which are noesis and noema. So you have noesis, which is kind of the act of thinking, but also the act of perceiving in general. And so everything that you are engaging in, being aware and being conscious in that sense, being directed towards something, is noesis. And noema is the sense, is the kind of the that which is at the end, or which is on the other side of you being directed towards. So it's what Hegel calls Wesen. Hegel would say Wesen. So the meaningful content that after all remains, also against perspectival shifts and situation changes. And one way to make this more comprehensible, get a better grip on that, is a question, or to follow the question, what is the major call of philosophy? And I would say it's this, right? If you look in the night sky, you're not just seeing a bunch of stars that are clustering eclectically on the sailing of the world, but you are seeing most probably to a certain degree some pictures of stars, star constellations. So there's a certain picture quality to it, and maybe also a certain sign quality, because you now you know the signs, all these star formations, but you see and what you see is also the star formation, not just a bunch of light points. Now this is something else than seeing the star formation is something else than seeing a bunch of eclectic light points, right? And there is reason, there is spirit allegedly entering the stage, there is sense, there is meaning to those stars or to these light points. So these are not just bunch of light points anymore, but they are star formations. They are forming a picture, an image. They are coming in a certain into a certain gestalt form. And this is the beginning of philosophy in some sense, in terms, in terms of coming up with an explanation why or how is it, why and how it is possible that we are not just seeing a bunch of light points. So we have something entering the stage which cannot be reduced to a bunch of light impressions, it seems, to a manifold of impressions and a sheer flux of contingencies, it seems, at least. And now we have to get our head around that. And the point that I want to make here to the end is exactly that, because right, we have reason entering the stage. We have, for example, categories entering the stage, which are said to be, for example, by Aristotle, right, to be like the necessarily constitutive for any act of understanding. So you know the physical world, but the world in general, and making sense out of things and bring an order into things by these categories like quantity, quality, and so on. And these are like the basic units of thinking, or the fundamental units of thinking, you would say. And they are said to be the fundamental units or categories of thinking. While they are, and this is why there are also so much worked out, or a lot of discussion is going on there. Then also speaking about modalities, right? Necessity, contingency, something that Leibniz comes up with. So contingency, it's lesser than necessity, but a little bit higher in degree on a scale than just happening by chance. And that could be also something that could also be otherwise, but nevertheless it has a certain account for it. So contingency is in between necessity and contingency, and could be could be also or is then also a modality. And with Kant, who mainly takes what he finds in Aristotle in terms of the categories, and Hegel, Kant mainly takes up in terms of categories what he finds in Aristotle, and Hegel then says, okay, well, yes, but where are these categories come from? So where do we arrive these categories from? So Hegel's project is to start presuppositionless and to derive the categories immanently, just by thinking, by engaging in thought itself, thinking. And so kind of explicating or unfolding the inner workings and the inner logic of thinking itself. This is kind of the project of Hegel in a nutshell. And now he develops these categories immanently, and what he says, and here is kind of the end note of this session, is that what he speaks of or makes the argument for, that the categories are not just something, what Husserl says and makes the argument for, that these categories are not just something that is in our mind, something that is kind of a filter layer of our cognitive apparatus or our capacity for cognition. But Husserl speaks of kategoriale Anschauer, categorical intuition. So his line of argumentation is that we actually see these categories. So he gives the example of an allée. So a street that is sidetracked by trees on both street sides, which is in French called allée. So, and Husserl says we not just see again like the star formation, we don't just see a bunch of eclectic trees standing there, but we see an allée. So we see a certain, or have a certain notion of what we see there. And it's not just that this is something that we just have in our mind, but it's actually that this category, or that these categories that are situation invariant, while we shift our view and we walk around objects, for example, we cross the side of the streets and we have different perspective, but now nevertheless we have always only one perspective, but we can look at these objects and formation and constellation and from situation to situation from different perspective. But what is staying invariant, this is just Husserl's claim, are the categories that are not just things of the mind. So Husserl is not doing this kind of dualism that on the one side there are the things of the mind, and then there is a world where you have the things of the world out there, or a kind of material world and material object. But we actually see these categories, we can intuitively grasp them because they really are there, and they are They are kind of real part of the phenomenal appearing. And as such, they are real because the phenomenal appearing is real. So there are also certain situations where our perception of phenomenal reality deceives us. But in terms of the fundamental traits of the possibility to cognize these fundamental traits, it is also possible to have truthful insights and intuit and look into into the eidetic realm, doing eidetic sightseeing of categories, which are general, or more and more general and universal atoms of thinking and perception then, or the fundamental units of thought and of conceptualization, of understanding and experience, and then also for mathematics. And this is the claim that Husserl makes, or was making, that this would also solve the problem then how we come up with ideal objects and handle ideal objects in mathematics and logic and still have them related to the everyday world, because it is something that we possibly could intuit. We could have this meaning for the content of all of the mathematical proofs if they are genuinely correct. We would be able to yet re-invoke the illustrative demonstration of insight, so looking into their truth, looking into their sense, and having the experience that they make sense, that sense is a tuning. But this is not possible because there are so many proofs. In principle, it would be possible, but the sheer amount makes it impossible. And the point Husserl is making, and what he's concerned about, because if that is not possible, so if it is not possible to re-invoke these the meaningful content, it could be the case that we just lost any direction, or perhaps we had never a direction that was grounding and that was kind of building or giving the fundament and heading us in any right direction, in quotation marks, when it comes to science. But it could be that science would have made moves on its own, or would move on its own, would have developed a dynamic of its own, and perhaps would move in a direction where we move into abstract spaces, which could be fictitious spaces of mathematics, for example. Right. And perhaps it could be that that science doesn't have a grounding or any relation to our life world and everyday world anymore.